Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Ask Anything presented by Mosier Consulting. I'm your host, Angel Leon, Mosier's Director of Personnel. We're glad you're with us for today's episode, and with us today is one of our repeat offenders here on Ask Anything. Mosier's Director of our Managed Services Department, Jim Timberman, is here. You might remember Jim from several of our episodes involving our Managed Services team. Most recently, he was on Season 2 in our ransomware episode. But today, we're talking about disaster recovery and backups. You might think, wait, didn't you guys talk about that at some point? We did. But this episode will be more geared towards the cost of not having those things in place in case of an emergency. You certainly won't want to miss this. Jim, it's great to have you back on Ask Anything. How have you been?
Good. Thanks for having me back. Appreciate it. Excited to talk about some new subjects.
Absolutely. And this is a subject that I think from an IT perspective should be on everybody's mind. From a general perspective, I mean, you can apply disaster recovery to just about anything in your life, honestly. But before we dive in, let's start again by defining what disaster recovery is.
Well, that's actually a great question. A lot of times people think of disaster recovery as, oh, my building's on fire, or we've been vandalized, or there's flooding, or something, or tornadoes whipped through, or something physically has happened. But in today's environment, it's more than just that. It's the idea of human error, vandalism, hacking, anything that can allow for loss of productivity really falls into that category. And it's not just across, the entire enterprise. It could be segmented into specific applications, specific environments, and so forth that need to be addressed and looked at as we kind of look at and oversee what constitutes a disaster recovery plan.
Well, you mentioned something about physical assets such as your building, and that's something that I want to ask you about, because in the past, you might have been worried about physical assets such as your building or that little room in the corner that's supposed to be your server room, and it's 100 degrees every time you walked in there. But nowadays, the worries are a little bit different, right? What can you tell us about the differences between the way people worried about these types of things maybe 10, 15 years ago to the worries we face right now? Because those are completely different.
Yeah, I mean, even in that aspect is, that on-premise server room and the data center locally is still a key part of a lot of companies' environments. But you also have to look at it from a cloud perspective that, you can't always guarantee that something isn't going to happen within Azure or AWS that will allow for any kind of outage or data loss. So in even ensuring that you have that information backed up is key, as well as your ability to recover that. We've seen some examples of some of our clients that have that use a SaaS provider for some of their applications. Well, technically that's their data. So if something happens to that company or to that application, that also impacts your data. So by having the ability to, back that data up and also put it somewhere where you can recover it quickly through a backup policy is very helpful, because I can name a couple examples where we've had a client, at the time wasn't our client, but became a client because of a situation where they were using a SaaS application. That company got hacked. Therefore, they were basically panicking to a point of, what do we do? What do we do? Well, do you have this, have that? They're like, no. Well, we had to spin some things up very quickly in order to get them up and running, and then put some preventative measures in place to ensure that even though they're still going to continue to use that application, that they have access to that data, they can back it up and recover it as needed. So again, it's, even if it isn't on-prem, you still have to protect it. You still have to ensure that you've got copies of it should any kind of issue come up. So.
Right, because you mentioned hacking, and I would say that would be your number one worry about anything in the cloud, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, there's, it's a great instance where it's, not only are you at risk, but the companies you deal with are at risk too. So, you've got to ensure that even though they've got some safeguards in place, you still have to have yours in place to ensure that, you can still manage and get to your data and become productive.
Basically have a backup to the cloud kind of a thing.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's not unusual to see companies that'll have a SaaS that they'll actually back up or actually copy their data over locally and then back that up to a cloud solution in order just to make sure that, they have it. So in case of an emergency or any kind of situation happens. Plus also too, there's different means that you can use within that and having that locally. So if they, choose to switch vendors, the migration piece of that is a lot more simpler. And also they can report against it a lot better. So there's some other value to doing that.
So, and I think my next question, you might have sort of quasi answered it, but I'm still going to ask it anyway, because I think it deserves a full, complete answer. And that is, what would you say would be the main goal of disaster recovery?
Actually, the main goal is the recovery piece of it and how quickly you can stand up an environment. And when we say that, we mean more of how quickly can we be productive again? Because with anything, where there's disaster or any kind of outage, it's a loss of productivity. So as an organization, depending on what you do, a lot of times we have become so dependent on IT and applications and being connected to the internet and having email and all this, that becomes critical. So any time down is loss of productivity and income. So the goal of that is to understand, okay, how quickly can we recover? Okay, so what's the time frame? That's the key thing. And the other side of that is how much data are we losing? Okay, so what's the loss of data? So if it goes down, our backups are every day. So we could lose a day's worth of data. Is that acceptable? How much is that going to cost you in the long run? With that, all that needs to be analyzed and determined, because again, all backup solutions are not created equal. There's different ways of doing it. And that's the main factor of what you need to figure in when you're determining what your policy is going to be.
Yeah, and that brings up a good question. So beyond the monetary aspect of things, because obviously, as you were mentioning, everything has a cost, whether that's productivity and everything that you mentioned before, because anything within disaster recovery could cost you an X amount of money, but it's not just about that money piece, isn't it?
That is true. It's not. And the way a lot of some of the disaster recovery solutions in themselves have become extremely affordable. If you look back, within the last 5 years, to have an off-prem cloud backup was really expensive. Nobody thought of it. They all thought about, okay, I got to have a SAN in my environment, or I got to replicate my data to another location across town. Now, with the emergence of, a lot of the cloud providers, AWS and Azure, especially, have really provided these kind of almost turnkey solutions that help companies in those situations where it is affordable and basically you're paying a storage cost versus actually a compute cost.
Speaking a little bit of when you have that disaster recovery set up in place, how often should organizations or CIOs or CTOs be verifying their disaster recovery setup?
So as we look at that and how often they should be looking, not only looking at it, but they should be testing it. They should establish their policies really based upon kind of two things. What's that risk of loss? Meaning how much data am I willing to lose? And then they build their policies to that. But the big key on that is the recovery. Okay. Is that if something does happen, what is it going to take for me to recover that environment and get back up and running? So as they look at it, they should not just say, okay, hey, this is what it costs me to do this backup, but how quickly can I recover? And are the assumptions that I'm making on the recovery time valid? So therefore testing is a key. So we've seen instances where we've worked with clients, new clients, that they haven't had a disaster recovery test done in 3 or 4 years. They're just like, oh, we know it works because, well, do you really? Are you sure? What are the gotchas? How long is it going to take? What's the risk involved? And what are the things that are going to come into play? Therefore, we know what to do to remediate those should we actually have to recover in a non-test environment or recover quickly.
Well, I see this as when you do a drill, as a I don't know, if you were going to do an emergency drill on tornadoes. So let's say there's a tornado coming for our office, God forbid, and people have to go somewhere in order to be safe? What's the safest location nearby? Where can we go to find shelter, et cetera? I view disaster recovery in IT just like that. I mean, if you don't practice that, people aren't going to know where they're supposed to go. If there's a tornado, if there's a fire within the building, where are those exits that you need to go to in order to escape the building if it's on fire? I view disaster recovery in IT just as as that.
Oh yeah, I totally agree, and that's the way a lot of the way we look at it too is because everybody just kind of says, oh, we've got something in place. There's a policy. There's a document. This is what we do. We have backups, but is it you really are unsure of that until it's actually tested, and at times some companies get to test a little bit more sooner than others because they have a little bit more older environments that they know that sometimes things go bad and they've got to recover quickly. But even in today's new environments, even cloud environments, understanding what that is and testing it to ensure that it works is the key, because like anything, it's an insurance policy that you have the ability to always check on.
And how often would you say every organization that has a disaster recovery, how often should they test that out?
At least yearly. That covers an opportunity for them, usually during that, usually identified during slow times of the year. A lot of times around the Christmas holiday, a lot of people do their testing on that. We usually recommend once or twice a year, that way, in case anything changes, because some things do change between, January to, December, servers get built, environments change, applications change, et cetera. Those need to be identified and then tested accordingly, and just ensure that everything that you do is documented and still works. The other side of that too is and I know we talk a lot about, the infrastructure side of things, your servers and your applications, et cetera. But something else to think about too within that is, backups and recovery from a workstation perspective. Even though a lot more cloud applications and Microsoft's kind of, with the 365 has the ability to keep everything in the cloud and back up to the cloud, but a lot of individuals still maintain a lot of stuff locally. And where something happened, where laptop gets stolen, it gets broke, it dies, et cetera. What is your policy for that? There's some other things that need to be looked at, not just in the application and production side of things, but also at the desktop level too. And I think a lot of people really kind of forget about that and assume that, oh, well, we'll just replace it and everything will be fine. Well, depending on who that individual is, it could be critical, where they have some key documents that were on there that they can't recover, or key information that can't be recovered. So
yeah, stolen or lost laptops are their own disaster recovery.
Yes, yeah. And that leads into a lot of other things too, of like, okay, what are you doing from a device management perspective? So when those do happen, you have the ability to remove, wipe those clean and remove them, or make the device worthless at that point.
To finish here, I want to ask you, what different types of solutions would you recommend for disaster recovery?
Actually, that's a great question, because it really all depends on their appetite, and because some things are expensive, some things are inexpensive. The questions we always ask is, okay, what's your level of loss? And when we say that, we don't really get into the monetary factor, because usually we understand our clients' budgets and what they're willing to spend, but we want to understand what's your data loss expectations. And with that, we'll establish the backup policy and where it goes. Right now, with a lot of the cloud solutions out there, we're looking at more of creating a matching environment up in AWS or Azure, and then kind of having that run on a very low compute, but we're doing replication from the production environment up there on a regular basis every 30 minutes, 40 hour or 2 hours daily, et cetera. And some clients actually want it every 5 minutes. They have the ability and the bandwidth to do that. Therefore, if something should happen to their production environment, there's triggers there that says, hey, that's down, go straight to the cloud environment and work in there. And that spins up quickly and identifies and is able to allow for users to continue to work, it's just pointed in a different place. That information's worked. And then once the on-premise or primary environment is brought back up and fixed, we just replicate over and then flip the switch and then go back to the primary, and the secondary goes back down to a small community. And with that, the cost of operations on it is pretty inexpensive compared to buying a NAS or a backup utensil or utility inside your premise versus, having a third party do it or something. We found it become a lot cheaper and a lot easier and less pain to the users on the back end, because now they don't know. It just automatically does it. There's no, we don't have to go through and update all the machines and do anything to point to a new location. It's all done systematically.
Sounds to me like it's a lot easier to get up and running than maybe even if you have a backup power plant at your home in case the lights go out.
Yep, exactly. Well, and even in that situation, if, during a true time of disaster where you're looking at a business continuity kind of plan where we have to change locations, well, as long as you have an internet connection, again, you're able to work. You don't have to be in the office, and it takes some of the VPN pieces out of it that you would have to do before. Instead, okay, if this happens, here's the instructions to maintain things. So from a user perspective, it simplifies things a lot, and it becomes unnoticeable.
Interesting. Well, this is a great topic, Jim. I'm sure we could talk about this for hours, but again, we would like to thank you for joining us and Ask Anything today to talk again about disaster recovery.
All right, Daniel, thanks for having me. I love doing this. Thanks for everybody's time. Appreciate it.
We'd like to thank Jim Timberman for joining us today and Ask Anything to talk about disaster recovery and its potential cost to your business. Ask Anything will be back next week with another episode, continuing to dive deeper with our resident experts and what they're currently working on. If you have an idea or a topic you'd like us to explore, please reach out to us through our social media channels. In the meantime, please remember to give us a rating and subscribe to our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, remember to back up and restore. So long, everybody.
Go.